Almost 20 years ago, a brutal regime that valued people according to the color of their skin fell in the face of global outcry. Now, for the first time, lawyers and politicians have looked at the defining features of the racist regime and compared them to Israel.
All of those crimes are compounded and compounded and compounded in the situation I see in Palestine.
In this edition of INfocus, we examine why the Russell Tribunal ruled Israel is an apartheid state. In 17 years since the abolition of apartheid in South Africa, a system that segregated people by race and handed out rights accordingly. Those who resisted were beaten, arrested, jailed, or killed. But towards the end of its 50-year stronghold, an international outcry grew so loud it overwhelmed politicians and lawmakers. Now, some of the very same opponents that toppled this racist regime have determined that the South African system was not the only apartheid. They are identifying their history with a place far beyond their borders. I came to Cape Town to find out why.
For us, for me, it has been such an uncanny, such an agonizing thing to see a replay of what used to happen here. And that is not a political statement. It's a statement of a human being. Someone says to you, you see that house? That used to be my home.
He was a leading opponent of the South African apartheid, renowned for inspiring courage in opposition to the racist regime in South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu addressed investigators who met in Cape Town to consider whether apartheid exists in Israel and Palestine. A jury heard testimony from both South Africa and Palestine as part of a citizen-based tribunal in response to calls from charities and campaigners. I wanted to find out why these connections are being made. My journey started in one of the areas where empty land remains a haunting memory of apartheid South Africa.
We're in District 6. As you can see behind me, this area is completely bare and overgrown. 60,000 people used to live here, but they were evicted and their homes were pulled down. The area was determined as being for white occupation only.
It had been a thriving multicultural community, but new laws meant each segment was farmed out to a separate area, the whites getting the best picks, those branded as coloureds given mediocre land, leaving the slums for the blacks. The destruction took place up and down the country. This is one of the only areas that stayed empty, people too affected by the brutality of the evictions to move in.
I'm actually sitting on the pavement next to what used to be one of the main roads that ran through this area. 50 years ago, right behind me, there was houses, and you can still see some of the rubble lying around in what is now barren land.
Just a short drive away, the centre of today's Cape Town is brimming with diversity and wealth. Evidence of the discrimination this society lived through for almost half a century is not obvious. To start to discover what forced segregation during apartheid had meant for South Africans, I went to meet Alan Busak, who fought apartheid both as a politician and an activist.
Apart from the physical crime of taking a person's land, apart from the physical crime of bulldozing a house, apart from the physical crime of taking people from a home that they have built and putting them in a one-bedroom place where all of a sudden their whole life has changed, there is this crime of destroying the natural transmission of values that belong in a community and that give a community a sense of worth and of permanency and of value and of humaneness. All of those crimes are compounded and compounded and compounded in the situation I see in Palestine.
In Palestine's West Bank, I had met just a few of the millions of families who had been driven from their homes in the face of bulldozers or military force. I saw how a separation barrier had been built to segregate them from Israelis. It also keeps them away from recovering the land they owned in breach of a United Nations resolution. Laws have been passed to remove their property and citizenship rights.
أول ما وعينا لحد الآن وإحنا بنعاني معاناة طويلة إن إحنا في إن إيش نكون نعيش في استقرار بس يكون زينا زي الناس إننا حقوق.
نشعر حالنا غريبين مع إننا أبناء المخيم يعني ولدنا في المخيم.
They say that there's no compensation for going back to their original land. They feel like strangers here, and they say that if they're moved somewhere else, they'll be like strangers there. They want to go back to their land where they can live with dignity.
The Russell Tribunal looked at how laws had been made in both South Africa and Palestine to keep one ethnic group in an economic trap. I wanted to see for myself how the forced isolation of Palestinians compared to the way those at the bottom of the South African class chain were deposed into townships that kept them away from the political and economic hub of society. So I travelled out of the centre of Cape Town to find out what remained of apartheid South Africa. Just 20 minutes away is a very different scene.
We're in one of the townships now. This one is called Guguletu, and it's the poorest part of the township. It's a squatter camp. It was actually built on a waste dump.
I met Makadizi there. He's an up-and-coming politician who hails from Guguletu.
The main challenge that would face an area like this is poverty, joblessness, and rampant crime, which would be as a result of their living conditions, These are people who would not say at 8 o'clock we're eating breakfast because they need to check where they would be getting breakfast, These are people who are not sure where the next meal would come from.
Was this created because of the apartheid?
Yes, this is as a result of the apartheid system. The fact that, in fact, the people who stay here, you would find them being black and African is not a coincidence. You would hardly find a white man staying here, And that's a condition created precisely by apartheid. Now, look, we have been ravished by the apartheid system. I mean, that's generally, there's no apartheid now, but its results and fruits are still being felt now.
Testimonies from people like Makadizi about life under apartheid were heard at the 3-day investigation. The jury also listened to first-hand accounts of experiences in Israel and Palestine. Terry Crawford Brown was one of the organisers.
The apartheid government and the Israeli government, I think that they can warehouse people in Bantustans. That was the idea of the grand apartheid, was create 10 mini-states. Dispossess people of their South African citizenship, and that is a parallel with the West Bank. it's totally unviable as an independent entity. It's cut up even more than the apartheid Bantustans were. We didn't have apartheid roads, we didn't have the wall. In many ways, the Bantustans were more viable in the West Bank.
He told me how the jury took into account testimonies that described how Israeli policies paved the way for the separation wall to fragment Palestinian communities, so they are confined to isolated enclaves. They are also barred from driving on the best roads and given reduced access to water and electricity compared to Israelis. Back at Guguletu, I wanted to find out what else people remembered that compared to Palestinian life.
We were forced to carry pass. Yeah, we had different identity documents. We were not carrying an identity document. Ours was a passbook, and then the whites, it was an identity.
He told me how anyone found in the white areas without the correct documents would have been arrested.
You know, the way it was so bad, you were resigned to accept unwillingly that now you are not an equal, but that was the situation and it was forced upon you.
Identity documents are inspected by Israeli soldiers at checkpoints. They decide whether Palestinians can go to neighboring towns where they may have family, go to school or require hospital treatment. The tribunal drew on international law when considering whether these restrictions are classified as apartheid.
According to Article 2 of the Convention on Apartheid, it includes measures preventing participation in political life, social, economic, and cultural life, and preventing full development by denial of basic human rights and freedoms. The right to move is one of those basic rights and freedom. The main form of control and regulation of Palestinian workers is through a permit system. In 2002, with the construction of the wall, farmers and agricultural workers were increasingly blocked from reaching their fields, while other workers, especially around Jerusalem, find themselves unemployed because now the wall has cut them from their places of work. In Gaza, where the Israeli siege has sealed off the territory completely, the situation is even worse. 60% of the population are now living under the poverty line, and unemployment rates are at 38%, but they are at 60% when it comes to youth.
But it was physical and psychological violence that was also used to control segregation during apartheid in South Africa. Dr. Busak was one of the South Africans who gave evidence to the tribunal about beatings and torture for offenders. I wanted to know what the connection is between control of movement and abuse in Palestine.
But of course, it's not just the checkpoint. It's not just the physical standing in line from 4 o'clock in the morning. It is the threat that goes with it. It's the systemic violence that is part of it. It's the humiliation. It's the danger that people are put in. The morning that I was there, I happened to see a 12-year-old boy being separated from his grandfather. And I understood that there are certain days in which a child would be allowed to go with a family member, even though that's not the mother or the father, but his grandfather. And while we were standing there, all of a sudden, these two burly policemen were dragging this young boy from across the space, 200 meters or something. And I was looking at it and I said, why is he crying? And somebody said to me, he can't cross the border, but his grandfather is sitting in a wheelchair on the other side. I mean, just the sheer inhumanity of it, the sheer evil genius of thinking things out in such detail, that is human destruction on a scale apartheid never reached.
He also told me about the lethal force used against civilians.
We've seen violence in this country over the years, and we've had our massacres over the years, right up until Sharpeville in 1960 and Soweto in 1976. But we've never in this country seen anything like the Gaza war. Never anything like that deliberate, overpowering attack on people's lives.
13 Israelis died in the 3-week war, but the force used against Palestinians was so severe it claimed around 1,500 Palestinian lives. With all borders shut, they had no relief from the intensive bombing campaign on major urban centers. But aside from war, there is something else that prompts lethal force from the oppressor: resistance. This group in Nabi Saleh are protesting because although it is illegal under international law, Israeli laws have been passed to allow Jews from anywhere in the world to settle in the West Bank.
The more they're likely to arrest people. If we're a larger number, then they will not be able to arrest.
The reason that they're protesting in this spot is because there's settlements right behind us, and the land on this side has been confiscated by the Israelis. It was formerly Palestinian land, and now they can no longer access it.
They have their own laws and preferential access to water. Israeli army officials ensure they are protected and punish the Palestinians that protest. For others, another fate awaits: jail. Palestinians have been imprisoned for throwing stones at army officials, for marching to land taken from their ancestors by force, or for armed resistance. In South Africa, one island was home to those caught striving for a just social order.
We're approaching Robben Island now, which you can see right behind me. This was where political prisoners fighting against the apartheid regime were held, including Nelson Mandela.
Some of those who opposed apartheid, whether armed or peaceful, were held for up to 30 years. Many were labelled terrorists. One of those was Ahmed Qasim. He spent 27 years in total on Robben Island, jailed for the first time when he was 17 for planting explosives.
Any person who lived under apartheid from 1948 to 1994, even if that person picked up one stone and threw it at a Casper or an armed vehicle, helped to liberate this country. Because it was not going to be liberated through speeches. There needed to be resistance to the oppressive machinery that was in place.
As someone who fought against an oppressive regime, how far do you identify with Palestinians who resist Israel?
I identify with them 150%, because they are in a worse predicament than we ever were. Because in this particular part of the world, at least we knew we were inside our territory. We could not be dislodged.
He spoke to me in the stone quarry where he and hundreds of other apartheid fighters were forced to carry out hard labour, breaking up stones for long hours in the burning heat or the bitter cold.
What's it like for you? What goes through your heart and your mind coming back to Robben Island where you were jailed?
A lot of things. Especially those who made the maximum sacrifice. They lived and died for the struggle and in the struggle. And then, of course, those who are still alive, they actually value the process of socialization which they had undergone while working this very quarry. And the question, was it all worthwhile? I think yes. We've only got this one life to live, so let us so live it. that we are proud to have lived a life like that.
After the abolition of apartheid, Robben Island prisoners were freed and honoured for their commitment to equality. The Russell Tribunal concluded that the Israeli military targets Palestinian activists and members of armed groups with the aim of suffocating any possible resistance to Israel's rule. But whether arrested for resistance or on another charge, when it comes to trial, another set of discrepancies exists.
What ends up happening is that two people living in the same territory who commit the same crime can be tried in vastly different systems that produce vastly different results.
Emily Schaefer is a lawyer practicing in Israel and explained that Palestinians are tried in military courts, whereas Israelis are tried in civilian courts. The jurors unanimously agreed that Israel is an apartheid state. Yasmin Suka, the executive director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, was also on the jury.
When you have that kind of systematic evidence, that's the picture you really need to build up this notion of institutionalized domination by one group over another. I think the other crucial question was that could we talk about two distinct racial groups? And that's very clear, that actually you can be a Jew anywhere and you can still have rights in the state of Israel, whereas the people who are born there, if they're Palestinian, they don't have any rights at all.
But it was treatment of Haneen Zoaibi, a member of the Israeli parliament, that gave final clarity to the decision of Michael Mansfield, a British QC.
After she'd given her evidence, we were informed that a member of the Knesset had applied to the ethics committee of the Knesset to have her Israeli citizenship withdrawn because there was criticism of Israel, particularly the question of whether it's an apartheid state. It seemed to me that she encapsulated the way in which Palestinians are treated. They are treated as second-class citizens, whether they're in Israel or in the occupied territories. Her personal testimony that convinced me that this was a terrible situation, possibly worse than it ever was in South Africa.
The separation could be seen in the way in which the cities were built, so the spatial arrangements, the social engineering, and with that came privileges in education and privileges in job creation and employment and all of that. But that wall is something that says in a very, very stark and terrifying way that the Israelis have been able to take the notion of apartheid and perfect it in a way that the Afrikaners in South Africa never could.
Despite the legal dismantling of the apartheid system in South Africa, a continued struggle for social equality goes on. Similarly, a well-backed-up tribunal that has ruled Israel is an apartheid state will form the backbone of a long road of political activism. In the next edition of INfocus, we look at how South African campaigners are fighting to overthrow oppression in Palestine.